We teach young women in particular that the fundamental goal of their life is going to be their career. And, first of all, most people don't have careers, they have jobs. And those are very different things. But you're not a very happy camper, so to speak, if you're 45 and you have no one. And it doesn't go upwards after that. So don't miss it. The mother is the person who also says, get out there, take your goddamn lumps, because you're tough enough so that you can handle it. She doesn't say, you just stay down there in your bedroom brooding away because the world is unfair and treating you badly and your suffering is too much. She says, yeah, there's a lot of suffering out there, but you're a hell of a lot tougher than you think you are. Most children now have older parents, right? Because people aren't having children until they're in their 30s. And there's a big difference between having a parent who's in his or her 30s and having a parent who's in his or her 20s.
Yep.
The 20-year-olds are still kind of like kids, and they're going to be more usefully neglectful, I would say. Well, look, one of the things we used to do with my daughter when she was very little was, she was about a year and a half, is we'd have her in a room alone, and she would usually complain about that for a few minutes, and then she'd find a way to amuse herself. She liked to take books out of shelves and put them back in, and like if you let her get through that initial bit of misery, then she would learn how to regulate herself, and she got very good at that. So that's a good example of minor privation having a positive influence. But children used to have multiple siblings. And siblings toughen you up because there's tremendous competition in families among siblings. And they had younger parents who had fewer resources. And, now parents are older, first of all. And second, they're more resource rich. And so they're more likely to schedule their children to death in some sense to provide them with all the opportunities that they feel would be useful. And that's understandable. And plus, because they have fewer children, each child is in some sense more precious. Not like if you have 10 children, you don't love all of them, but there's 10 of them. There's only so much excess attention that can go around, and they do a lot of socializing each other rather than being socialized by parents. But if you only have one child, you're going to devote all your resources to providing them with absolutely everything you can provide them with, and one of the dangers of that is that you'll overprotect them and you'll provide them with too much. And we don't understand those dynamics, right? We don't understand how much you should stay hands off your kids and let them go out there and make their own mistakes and find their own way. And that's tricky, and we're ignorant about it. And so I think one of the consequences of that is that we do have a reasonable percentage of young people, maybe young adolescents, the kind that you hear about at university, who have been overprotected and overscheduled and under-challenged in some sense. And so they're not very resilient. And then, of course, what's happening in the universities, the safe spaces and the trigger warnings and all of that. Yeah. And there's good recent research on this. Trigger warnings clearly make things worse rather than better. We extend that overprotection far longer than is helpful. It's hard though, because as I said, when you have resources, you can use them to make your children's lives, let's say, easier. But the question is, do you really want to make the life of someone you love easier? And that's an incredibly difficult question. Well, there's a supreme sacrifice demanded on the part of the mother, and there's a supreme sacrifice demanded on the part of the son, and there's a supreme sacrifice demanded on the part of the father, all at the same time. And then that makes the supreme sacrifice possible, and hypothetically that's the one that renews. That's the sacrifice that renews and redeems. It's a hell of an idea, man. And the thing about it is that I don't know if it's true, but I know that its opposite is false. And generally the opposite of something that's false is true.
its opposite is false, is because if the mother doesn't make the sacrifice, then you get the horrible Oedipal situation or something like that in the household, which is just its own absolute catastrophic hell. And if you want a really good insight into that, I would say watch the documentary Crumb, C-R-U-M-B. A man that's been rated by some critics as the best documentary ever made, and it is some piece of work, man. It is the only thing I've ever seen that actually lays out the Oedipal catastrophe in its full nightmare. So you could look at that. So if the maternal sacrifice isn't there, then that doesn't work. If the paternal sacrifice isn't there, if the father isn't willing to put his son out into the world, let's say to be broken and betrayed and all of those things, then that's a non-starter because the kid doesn't grow up. And then if the son isn't willing to do that, well, then who the hell is going to shoulder the responsibility? So if those three things don't happen, then it's cataclysmic, it's chaotic, it's hell. If they do happen, is it the opposite of that? Well, you could say, well, maybe it depends on the degree to which they happen. And it's a continuum. How thoroughly can they happen? Well, we don't know, because you might say, how good a job do you do of encouraging your children to live in truth? Let's say. Well, that's part of the answer to this question. And the answer likely is, well, you don't do as good a job of it as you could. So it works out quite well, but you don't know how well it could work if you did it really well or spectacularly well or ultimately well or something like that. You don't know. And people have an intimation of this because one of the things that's really cool about having a young baby, this is something you don't know till you have it. There's two things you don't know. There's a lot more than two. There's three things you don't know until you have a baby. The one is that you didn't grow up yet. Because you actually don't grow up until someone else is more important than you. You can't. So people think they grow up if they don't have children, but they don't. They just think they do. Now, there are some people who make sacrifices of other sorts, but this is a whole different ball of wax as far as I'm concerned. It's not a very elegant metaphor, but you learn that it's kind of a relief not to be the center of attention. That's cool, that you can sit back. Because, of course, your child in your family and in society is immediately the center of attention. And so, unless you're narcissistic, then you allow that to happen. And then you learn all sorts of really good things about other people, because other people really like babies. It's so cool. I lived in Montreal when we had our first child, and I lived in a pretty rough neighborhood, by Montreal standards, right? It's like, Montreal is such a great city, like Toronto. It's like even the rough neighborhoods they're more like charming with a little, dark underbelly, something like that. But there were some rough characters in our neighborhood, and it was pretty poor. And we'd push her around in her stroller, and these like grizzled, wrecked old guys would come by, and they'd look at her, and they'd just light up, and they'd come over and like smile at her, and you just saw the positive element of their humanity just well forth. There has to be something seriously wrong with you if you don't respond that way to a baby. That's not good. That's not good. But it was so cool to see these people. You kind of give them, generally you'd sort of walk 4 feet around them on the street, and yet they were all of a sudden, the layers that were on them would just fall off, and and the babies are sort of like public property, weirdly enough, too. Sort of like pregnant women, because people often treat pregnant women sort of like they're public property, too. I mean, in a positive way. Oh, wow, look, you're going to have a baby, eh? And then, they do all sorts of cute things. Well, what's the sacrifice of the mother? Well, that's easy. If you're a mother, if you're a mother who's worth her salt, you offer your son to be destroyed by the world. That's what you do. That's what's going to happen, right? He's going to be born, he's going to suffer, he's going to have his trouble in life, he's going to have his illnesses, he's going to face his failures and catastrophes, and he's going to die. That's what's going to happen. And if you're awake, you know that, and then you say, well, perhaps he will live in a way that will justify that. And then you try to have that happen.